Come, Frau Rabotti. Leonie Bialas was 14 when she learned what those words meant. Work, woman. It was February 1945, and Soviet soldiers had just stormed into her uncle's cellar in Breslau. She can still see herself sitting in that circle, her mother beside her, her youngest brother Winfried on the other side. The soldier looked around, saw her, and yanked her toward the door. Her mother screamed. Only her mother screamed. On the doorstep of that cellar, between one breath and the next, childhood ended. 70 years later, Leonie could finally say it aloud. I was taken. That phrase, taken, became the language of 2 million women across Europe and Asia who discovered that liberation was someone else's word. For them, May 1945 brought no peace. This is the story that didn't make it into the victory parades. The one buried beneath medals and Marshall Plans and Cold War alliances. We're following the voices that waited lifetimes to speak. 4-year-old Margot, who heard screams through bedroom walls in Bavaria. Konrad, who spent 40 years believing he was American, only to discover he was Russian. Anna Rosa, stolen from her grandmother at age 10, and shipped to France because she was proof of someone's shame. Their testimonies, and the silence that surrounded them, reveal a conspiracy that crossed every border and every ideology. By the end, you'll understand why it took 70 years for these stories to surface, and why they still make governments uncomfortable. When you picture the end of World War II, what do you see? Sailors kissing nurses in Times Square, Churchill flashing his V sign, champagne corks popping in Paris, American soldiers handing chocolate bars to grateful children. The Allies as liberators, heroes, the forces of good triumphant over evil. That image isn't wrong, but it's catastrophically incomplete. Because while photographers captured those moments for posterity, millions of women were living through nights no camera would record. Nights that governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain had compelling reasons to erase. Nights that challenged every narrative about who the good guys were. The silence wasn't accidental, it was policy. Documents were classified, hospital records destroyed, witnesses intimidated, survivors dismissed as collaborators, liars, or threats to national recovery. The conspiracy to forget stretched from Moscow to Washington, from London to Paris to Tokyo. This is not just history, it's memory that refused to die. What does a child understand about screams? Margot was 4 years old in April 1945, sheltering with her mother and a female cousin in a house on Fahrgasse in Landshut, Bavaria, right next to the church, as if proximity to God might offer protection. The American soldiers who'd just occupied the town forced their way inside, several of them heavily armed. They searched the house room by room until they found it, a Wehrmacht uniform hanging in a bedroom cupboard. Where is this man? Where is the soldier? The questions grew sharper, more aggressive. They drove the women into the bedroom. One soldier threw Margot's grandmother onto the bed and began tearing at her clothes. 4-year-old Margot watched from the doorway. She didn't understand what was happening, but she understood the terror, the violation, the helplessness of the women who were supposed to protect her. For 80 years, Margot stayed silent. Her family never spoke about the events of that April night. Not once. It was only when Margot was in her 80s that she finally told her daughter Maximilian what she'd witnessed. And Maximilian, a journalist, realized that her grandmother's story wasn't unique. It was a pattern that entire communities had conspired to forget. She began investigating in the rural villages of Bavaria, searching for other witnesses. It took almost a year to find anyone willing to talk. A year. In communities where everyone knew what had happened, where the screams had echoed through cellars and bedrooms and church halls, it still took 12 months to find a single person brave enough to confirm the truth. The silence had outlasted the generation. Why would it take a year to find witnesses to events that affected thousands? Maximilian Heigl discovered the answer in the villages between Upper Bavaria and Lower Bavaria, particularly in the district of Altötting. This was deeply Catholic territory, with layers of social control. The kind of place where reputation mattered more than truth, where family honor could be destroyed by a whispered rumor, where women were expected to bear suffering in silence. She knew assaults had occurred. Church records hinted at it. Family stories whispered about it. But finding women or men willing to speak on record meant confronting 60 years of shame, guilt, and blame that had calcified into community identity. The silence had layers. Survivors felt dirty, somehow complicit in their own violation. Society in that era viewed female sexuality as fundamentally unreliable. When doubt existed, the ruling always went against the woman. She must have seduced him. She must have wanted something. She was selling herself for food, for protection, for chocolate bars and cigarettes. Women who'd been raped were held partly to blame for their own assault. Families worried about dishonor. What would the neighbors think? What would it do to their daughter's marriage prospects? Better to bury it. Better to never speak of it again. And underneath all of that ran something even darker. The victims of this violence were often treated with more contempt than the perpetrators. In France, women accused of horizontal collaboration, relationships with German soldiers, had their heads shaved in public humiliations that often escalated to mob violence. The tondus, they were called. Some had merely worked in German offices or accepted food from soldiers to feed their starving children. 20,000 women subjected to ritualized shame, while actual collaborators who'd profited economically often walked free. Germany had its own version. Women who'd been raped by Allied soldiers were called the American's darling, or the Frenchman's whore. They were driven from their villages, forced to give up their children, marked as damaged goods. The perpetrators often went home to parades. The victims went into hiding. Silence is its own kind of violence. It can last longer than war. When devotion couldn't save them. They were at evening mass when the enemy arrived. It was May 1st, and the small Bavarian village had gathered for May devotions, a Catholic tradition honoring the Virgin Mary, a ritual of protection and peace. Inside the church, they could hear the sounds through the stone walls, tanks rumbling, vehicles grinding to a halt, boots hitting cobblestone. Suddenly, the priest's voice cut through the prayers. The enemy has forced its way into our village. Go home. The women and girls are to comport themselves with dignity vis-à-vis the enemy. Comport themselves with dignity. As if dignity could stop what was coming. As if modest behavior and proper Catholic virtue could serve as armor against soldiers who'd just spent weeks fighting their way through the Bavarian countryside, encountering pockets of fierce Nazi resistance where teenage boys with Panzerfausts had killed their comrades. 2 young American soldiers came upstairs to where one family was hiding. They saw the mother and her teenage daughter and attacked them immediately. Right there, in front of the younger children. In front of witnesses who would spend the next 70 years pretending they'd seen nothing. This wasn't an isolated incident in one village. It was a pattern that repeated across Bavaria in those chaotic weeks of April and May 1945. In some places, Germans surrendered without a fight, white flags hanging from windows, and the American troops moved through peacefully. But just kilometers away, Hitler's last contingents, fanatical SS units and indoctrinated Hitler youth, would put up desperate, suicidal resistance. And that resistance had consequences. Historians who've studied the patterns have found a direct correlation. The places that resisted most fiercely suffered the highest rates of sexual violence when they finally fell. Soldiers whose comrades had just been killed by German holdouts arrived in villages with rage, with adrenaline, with a sense that the civilian population had brought this upon themselves. Take Moosburg, near Freising. There was a large prisoner of war camp there, where Allied soldiers had been held under brutal conditions. When U.S. troops liberated the camp and saw how their comrades had been treated, skeletal, diseased, traumatized, something snapped. They moved through Moosburg systematically. According to reports, they made marks on houses where women lived, target markers, prey signs. The local priest documented it in his report. Sexual assaults carried out not randomly, but methodically, house by house. His report is one of the few surviving pieces of evidence because, by 1945, rectories were among the only German institutions still functioning. Priests became accidental historians, documenting what everyone else wanted to forget. Even witnesses can betray the truth, not by lying, but by how they choose to remember. Leonie Bialas was almost 15 when the Red Army encircled Breslau. The Silesian capital, now the Polish city of Wrocław, had survived most of the war relatively unscathed. While other German cities were reduced to rubble by Allied bombing, Breslau remained largely intact. Residents had a grim joke about it. That's why we're in for it now. They were right. In February 1945, Soviet forces formed a ring around the city, cutting it off completely. Hitler declared Breslau a fortress city. It was supposed to serve as a bulwark, stopping the Russian advance westward. But the order to evacuate came far too late. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were trapped inside as the battle began. Leonie and her family huddled in her Uncle Reinhold's cellar, her father's youngest brother. She can still see that cellar in her mind. All of them sitting in a circle, her mother beside her, her youngest brother Winfried on her mother's other side. Waiting, listening to the artillery getting closer, the building shaking with each impact. Then the Soviet soldiers stormed in. I don't know if we screamed or cried, Leonie remembers. We trembled sitting there. One soldier came in, looked around, saw her. He yanked her toward him. Her mother cried out. Leonie knows exactly how he threw her to the floor. She remembers the doorstep where it happened. That precise location burned into memory. Only my mother screamed. And then we lay in one another's arms and sobbed. Leonie and her mother were among approximately 1.4 million women raped while fleeing East Prussia and Silesia, often repeatedly over days or weeks. The Nazi propaganda about the Red Menace had terrified German civilians, but it hadn't been entirely propaganda. German soldiers returning from the Eastern Front knew what they'd done to Soviet civilians. They knew what revenge might look like. And revenge came. Soviet soldiers entered Germany, carrying memories of villages burned, families murdered, children starved. They'd seen what the Wehrmacht had done during the invasion of the Soviet Union, the scorched earth, the mass executions, the deliberate targeting of civilians. Some carried orders. Some carried permission. Some carried a Red Army leaflet that reportedly read, "Crush the Germanic women's racial pride. Take them as your rightful spoils." Whether that leaflet existed or was itself propaganda, the sentiment was real. Soviet commanders knew what their troops were doing and did little to stop it, at least not initially. In the chaos of combat, military discipline collapsed. Officers who tried to enforce order faced resistance from their own men. Stalin's delayed response to reports from the field signaled tacit permission. By the time Soviet command finally issued orders threatening punishment for rape, it was too late. The damage was catastrophic, generational, irreversible. In the house next door, women from Munich had taken shelter after being evacuated. 4-year-old Margot heard them screaming in the night. Terrible screams. Screams that a child couldn't understand but would never forget. In the morning, she asked what had happened. The adults told her, "People came and raped the women." The screams were so horrendous that Margot couldn't sleep. For her, and for an entire generation of German women, it became a nationwide catastrophe. Those are the words survivors would use decades later when they finally spoke. Not an isolated incident, not collateral damage, a nationwide catastrophe. The phrase Kampffrau, Rabote became synonymous with terror across Eastern Germany. Work, woman. The words Soviet soldiers would use as they went door to door, cellar to cellar, hunting for women and girls. It didn't matter if you were 8 or 80. It didn't matter if you were pregnant, sick, or hiding with children. German women developed survival strategies. They hid in attics, in rubble, in sewers. They cut their hair short and dressed as boys. They rubbed ash and dirt into their faces to look old, unattractive, diseased. Some stayed hidden for weeks, emerging only when starvation forced them out. Many were found anyway. The attacks followed patterns. Soldiers moved systematically through buildings, often in groups. Women would be assaulted repeatedly over hours, days, weeks. The same woman, the same cellar, different soldiers. Some women kept count. Most stopped counting. Historian Anthony Beever's research, drawing from Soviet military archives and German hospital records, estimates that approximately 100,000 women were raped in Berlin alone during the final battle and its immediate aftermath. In the entire Soviet occupation zone, the number exceeds 500,000. These are conservative estimates. The actual numbers were likely much higher. The violence wasn't random. It was a weapon. As one historian put it, rape is an old cultural pattern in wartime. With it, the victor shows the enemy soldiers, "You can't protect your women." It's a way of dishonoring the men's military honor. But that explanation, while true, is also insufficient. Because this wasn't just about dishonoring German men. It was about rage, revenge, power, the complete dehumanization that war enables. It was about soldiers who'd been brutalized by years of combat, who'd lost comrades and family members, who'd been given implicit permission by commanders who looked the other way. And it was about a breakdown of moral order so complete that even liberators became perpetrators. War doesn't just destroy cities. It destroys the categories we use to make sense of good and evil. Berlin wasn't an anomaly. It was the culmination of a pattern that stretched across Eastern Europe. As Soviet forces pushed westward from 1944 onward, reports of mass sexual violence followed their advance like a shadow. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia. In East Prussia, the violence was so widespread and systematic that German civilians fled en masse, creating one of the largest refugee crises in European history. An estimated 2 million Germans fled westward in the winter of 1944 to 45. Thousands died during the exodus, from cold, from starvation, from attacks along the route. Women fleeing the Red Army faced an impossible choice: stay and face certain assault, or flee into winter and face probable death. Historian Norman Neymark documented that in some Hungarian villages, virtually every female over the age of 12 was raped when Soviet troops passed through. Every single one. The violence was so complete that it destroyed the social fabric of entire communities. In the Balkans, Yugoslav partisans reported similar patterns. Romanian civilians documented Soviet soldiers' behavior. Czech women who'd welcomed the Red Army as liberators found themselves victimized within hours of liberation. The pattern reflected multiple factors: revenge for Nazi atrocities, yes, but also a complete breakdown of military discipline in combat zones. Officers who tried to maintain order faced resistance from their own troops. Stalin prioritized military advance over soldier conduct. Individual commanders made individual decisions about whether to enforce discipline or look the other way. Some units had relatively few incidents. Others were catastrophically violent. The difference often came down to a single factor: whether the commanding officer treated sexual violence as a serious breach of military discipline or as an inevitable, even justified, aspect of occupation. But here's what's crucial to understand. This pattern wasn't unique to the Red Army. Every occupying force in World War II, Soviet, American, British, French, Japanese, included perpetrators. The rates varied dramatically, the command responses differed, the level of systematic versus opportunistic violence fluctuated. But no army was innocent. The question isn't which army committed atrocities. They all did. The question is why some armies had higher rates than others, and what that tells us about the role of command culture, military discipline, and institutional accountability in preventing wartime sexual violence.